came to Anderson. I well remember my first day at the Independent Mail. You were there. Worked there for about 10 years, I guess, and did different things. But one of the things I did is I wrote a book review column, and I wrote it every week for years. So I had to read a book every week for years, which really wasn't that hard to do. I've always loved reading ever since I was a little girl. I was one of these kids that always had her nose in a book and, walk into the car with her nose in the book and that business.
What kind of got you involved in the community other than just the writing and stuff?
So I was always really interested in the arts. So one of the first things I did, had to get permission from my boss at the newspaper, was to serve on the Arts Council board. And, they said, oh, well, that's not a controversial board. That shouldn't be a problem. So that was it. I've served on other boards intermittently, the Free Clinic. But the big thing in community involvement for me was when I started the Cancer Association of Anderson in 2003. And not alone, I had an awful lot of help. And I like to say my wingmen were Garrick Chittister, who worked at ANMED then, and Lila Albergati. And it was the fifth of the nonprofits Lila started in her very long and useful life. What really got me into book writing was that Jack McIntosh had approached me about helping him put together his memoirs, which was an episodic memoir called Don't Kill All the Lawyers, I'll Give You a Short List. And it was a huge success. I edited it and went through the publication process, got it printed at Pimp Printing here. And when we had a launch party for him at the museum, 500 people came, including all the lawyers in town who wanted to be sure they weren't on the short list. Dr. Marshall Metters, my beloved late friend, talked me into interviewing World War II veterans at Anderson, and I wrote a collection of their stories called A Necessary War. I was just looking at that book a little while ago. Met some wonderful people that way, all but one of the 20 people I wrote about have passed on since then. For then, I just had an interest in writing a biography of President Roosevelt's private secretary, Missy LeHand.
Okay, that seems like a jump. How did that happen, Karen? Why were you so interested in Missy LeHand?
I wanted to be Missy LeHand because I love FDR, and I thought, wow, what a job. She lived in the White House. She worked for the most interesting man of the century, and then I found out she died when she was 47, and I thought, well, maybe I don't want to be her, but I would love to read a biography about her. And I found out no one had ever written one. And, I went up, I contacted people at the FDR Library in New York, and nope, no one's ever written it. It's a story that needs to be told. So I just started doing some research and poking around a little bit, reading what other people had written, and was able to get hold of her medical records. And it showed just that everything that had ever been written about her was wrong. And that she had been portrayed as this sort of pathetic, lovesick secretary who had nervous breakdowns all the time. And actually, she had a very severe heart defect from her childhood bout with rheumatic fever. She would have bouts of atrial fibrillation. They would treat it with a drug, warfarin, that she was allergic to, and it would just send her over the edge. And actually, she was just a very highly respected woman who really basically served as FDR's chief of staff. So with all the dumb luck in the world, I got a New York agent, and she sold the book to Simon & Schuster. Books that have been written since then give her a lot more respect, and they cite the Gatekeeper. So I'm in footnotes and things like that, and it's just really changed the whole perspective of the Roosevelt history world about Marguerite LeHand, and she's being given her due for the great woman that she was. After I finished The Gatekeeper, it was just so hard to have Missy die and have to let go of Missy. I've portrayed Missy on many occasions. I do the Boston accent. I have a dress that I wear. And I've given the Missy LeHand talk in 5 or 6 states now, all over the place. Love portraying Missy, but I had this idea, and I ran it past Kelly Durham, who's someone I went to high school with. He's a couple of years younger than I am. We both went to Daniel High. And I had edited some of his books. He self-publishes these terrific World War II thrillers. And our writing styles are so similar, and we're interested in the same era. So I had this idea about writing a mystery, a caper novel, where Missy LeHand is involved in recovering Shirley Temple, the little actress Shirley Temple, who she had actually met in a kidnapping caper. So we just kind of worked on this book together by email and wrote it in about 2.5 months. And it's called Shirley Temple is Missing. We paid to have a review done by Kirkus Books, a objective review. They gave it a great review. And our friend Jed Smith, who went to high school with us, now lives in Italy. He's a commercial and fine artist, does our covers for us. So we have written 5 of those now. The newest one is actually available now as an ebook, will soon be available as a paperback, and it's called Murder on the Campaign Train. And it's it's like an Agatha Christie murders someone's on the train. Everybody has to stay on the train until they can figure out who did it.
So how did you become interested in the alcohol and religious aspect?
Actually is because of my father and son. But Dad had a theory, a regulation that's accepted now called Bootleggers and Baptists, and it's based on the Blue Laws. Baptists and Bootleggers are both in favor of banning alcohol sales on Sunday. The Baptists because it's a sin, the Bootleggers because it opens up the market to them. And his theory is that if you've got moral cover for a regulation, it's much more likely to get passed and much more likely to stay in place. So about 8 years ago, he and Adam, who had his PhD by then, wrote a book of case studies together called Bootleggers and Baptists. And I was so proud of them. They're 50 years apart in age. Dad is now 90, Adam's 40. And I was just telling people about this book that my father and son had wrote. And as soon as I got the title out of my mouth, they'd go, "Ooh, Bootleggers and Baptists, that sounds like a fun book." And I'd have to say, "Well, it's an economics book. It's interesting. But it's not a lot of fun." And then I thought, what if I wrote a really fun book about the real Bootleggers and Baptists of the Prohibition era? So it is a fun book. It's a history book. It's got cocktail recipes in it. And what's different about this and other books about Prohibition is it's all based in the South. The South went dry way before the rest of the country. So we had gotten all of our underground channels of liquor production organized by the time Prohibition began in 1920. So we're shipping moonshine north. We're rum running all down the coast. And there's just some incredible stories that come out of the South. And I made it up as a series of expeditions because I was doing field research in Florida and Tennessee and Kentucky and Georgia and South Carolina. So I would tell you, if you wanted to do the same expedition I did, I'd tell you places to go, places to, speakeasies, cemeteries where notorious people are buried. And I had so much fun writing this book and got so many great other stories that I did a follow-up called Methodists and Moonshiners. And I remember from our years working together what a fan you were of Andy Griffith. So one of the places we go is Mount Airy, and I'm sure you've been up there, and you've been to Snappy Lunch and had the pork chop sandwich.
Of course.
But, there were a lot of episodes of Andy Griffith that had to do with moonshine, lots of them. It was always done for yucks and laughs. There were no shootouts and all that, but there was some very bloody shootouts in that part of North Carolina and Virginia because it's right on the border. There was a shootout right over the line in Hillsville, Virginia. This guy, he was kind of like a Murdaugh person, very powerful but a crook, and he just refused to be sentenced. And he was tried and convicted and was being sentenced to go to prison, and he just stood up and said, "Gentlemen, I ain't a-going." And just gunfire erupted all over the courtroom, and the judge, the sheriff, the prosecuting attorney, the jury foreman, and one of the jurors were all murdered right there. He did actually go to jail, and he was executed too, but it was all his kinsmen they had hidden weapons in the courtroom, and then other people defending themselves. One of the big surprises on this trip was, do you know who else very famous is from Mayberry? Or 2 other people? Chang and Ing, the original Siamese twins. That was just the kind of things you stumble on. And Chang was an alcoholic and Ing wasn't. How does that work? Not so well. Another thing that I did with Methodists and Moonshiners that was so much fun is I went all the way back to George Washington's day. And George Washington made a tour of the South in 1791. He went from Philadelphia to Mount Vernon, got everything all situated there, and then went all the way to Savannah and back over about 3 or 4 months, 2,000 miles, by coach and ferry and boat and every other conveyance you could think of. And there weren't any trains. There wasn't an interstate. There wasn't GPS. Good heavens. But I started at Mount Vernon because George, after his presidency, became a distiller and had one of the largest distilleries in the country at Mount Vernon. And they resurrected the distillery about 20 years ago, and they make rye whiskey there. So at 11 o'clock on a Monday morning, I'm drinking rye whiskey out of a barrel, all in the name of research, and just went on following down to Fredericksburg and Richmond, New Bern, and Wilmington, North Carolina, Georgetown, and ending in Charleston and Savannah. Just checking out all the stories about where George Washington stayed and the parties and the drinking and the toast and that. And it kind of gives you a picture of what the level of alcoholism in colonial and young America. And then you get to Savannah. And the year that George Washington was there is the year that John Wesley died in England. But he had been a preacher in Savannah and had a very short and unhappy time there. Had gone back to England and had started sending Methodist missionaries. And they were the ones that drove the temperance and prohibition movements much more than the Baptist. So, and that kind of, he started planting Methodist churches, and the pendulum starts swinging towards temperance. And by the end of the 19th century, they were able to convince most of the people in this country that prohibition was a good idea, which it wasn't. There was a big survey in 1926 about would you like prohibition modified to allow, they called it light beer and light wine. And actually that was what Franklin Roosevelt, that was one of the things he did during the 100 Days, was he got Congress to pass the Beer and Wine Revenue Act. Because the treasury is empty. You could use the revenue and you could put all these people back to work in legal jobs.
But didn't Lincoln fund the war with revenue from...
Yes, Lincoln did, yeah. And that was one thing that stalled the temperance movement before the Civil War, is they had gotten rid of the whiskey excise tax in Jefferson's presidency. Lincoln brought it back along with luxury tax of, feathers and all kinds of crazy things. And after the war, the people in the South who had never been taxed on their alcohol, all of a sudden these revenue agents are showing up, like Snuffy Smith was always hiding from, saying, you owe tax on your whiskey, we have to pay the debts of the Union Army. You can imagine how popular that was. So that was that beginning of what they call blockaders, running away and hiding their whiskey. A very violent time, a lot of tragedy, and just a lot of stuff you read and you think, how could this really be true? And it's all true.
So what else are you working on right now then?
I write the equivalent of a very small daily newspaper every day on Substack. Substack's a publishing platform. And I write about the daily lives of people based on their diaries. I've got a diary from 1926 from a guy in Rome, Georgia, and a couple in New Orleans in 1943. Bought the diaries on eBay and Etsy. And I write about what happened in these people's lives and then what was going on in the bigger picture. So I read the newspapers from that day. The one from 1943 is especially interesting because New Orleans was a huge shipping and shipbuilding port. The Higgins boats were built there that were used in the landings on D-Day. They had aircraft plants. It was just a gigantic bases all around. And this little couple from Ohio has just gotten married and moved down here. They've never lived away from home before. They're newlyweds. They're really sweet. And it's just fun to write about their day-to-day activities and go into the movies and this and that and the other, and then read about what is going on. I mean, at this point in November 1943, the Russians are about to capture Kyiv. We're glad because they were taking it from the Germans. If they were to capture Kyiv today, it would not be a good thing. That was 80 years ago. I put 2 posts a day up from that, and it's called bootleggers.substack.com. So you can get most of the posts for free, but I do have a subscription where you get more information, more of the post. And I put book reviews, I put cocktail recipes, I just do anything that's fun and funky. And my dad writes some stuff for it too, so that's good. You get some good economics in it, and sometimes my son does. And then I do a lot of public speaking, which I love.
You weren't a drama person at any point, were you? I mean,
Well, I wrote plays.
Right.
I've done a little acting, but I've been a playwright and have had several of my plays produced, so I love that. And as my mother says, I'm a ham. And I get really enthusiastic about a subject, and I just love to talk about it. So with the Martha Washington thing, I thought it'd be fun just to dress like Martha and talk about George's trips.
where can people find your books if they want to buy books?
They can buy them at McDowell's. She carries all my books.
She does such a good job down there.
Oh my God, Judith's wonderful. Yeah. So she carries my books, and you can buy them directly from the publisher, Evening Post Books. Just Google it. They don't charge any postage, so free shipping. And then they're for sale on Amazon too. And the Kindle books are obviously you get those from Amazon. There'll be a hardback version of Methodists and Moonshiners for about $30 and a paperback for $25. And then Baptist and Bootleggers is only in print as a paperback. You might be interested on who's on the cover. That's Carrie Nation on the right. She's the lady who took a hatchet and just, beat bars to smithereens. She was terrifying. And then the other guy is Al Capone. And on the cover of this book was a man I had never heard of before I started doing this, named W.D. Upshaw. He was a Georgia congressman who styled himself the driest of the dry. And he'd do nutty things like get a picture of him holding an umbrella so it looked like he was holding it over the Capitol building. And then the guy on the left is a former bootlegger turned kidnapper named Machine Gun Kelly, and that was taken at Alcatraz, I think. So I always have a bad guy, a dry and a wet on my two sides of the book. And I also post on Facebook, whenever I'm having speaking engagements and stuff like that. And I also post my Substack stuff on my personal Facebook page. So that's another way to keep up with it. I've got lots of friends and always welcome more.